We're diving into a question that, well, it's consumed thinkers for millennia, hasn't it? What is human purpose?
It's the big one.
Yeah, but today, instead of looking for, purely spiritual answers or neat philosophical definitions, we're putting on our evolutionary spectacles. We're here to investigate how that cold, hard biological drive, the one that just makes us replicate ourselves, eventually morphed into something much more complex.
Right, into this culturally mandated obligation almost to contribute to a civilization.
Exactly.
And that's really the core analysis drawn from the material you shared, specifically the work of humanist sage James Dalton. His analysis, Directional Human Purpose, is quite compelling on this.
Dalton, right.
Yeah, he argues that human purpose, in a functional sense, it isn't really about finding some grand cosmic meaning. It's more about our evolutionary trajectory.
Okay.
A kind of mechanism that ensures the continuity of our species, even if that mechanism, let's say, changes its vehicle over time, shifting from pure genetics to something else.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because we aren't just, summarizing a history of ideas here.
No, not at all.
Our mission for you, the listener, is to really trace this evolutionary path. We'll analyze purpose, starting from that base biological necessity, then look to the critical social requirements that emerged. We want to pinpoint that crucial tipping point where culture essentially grabbed the steering wheel of human direction.
That's the key moment.
And finally, we'll look closely at how our earliest social hierarchies got established and, maybe most critically, who really benefited most from this fundamental shift in what defined human success.
It's quite a journey. It takes us from, the single self-replicating molecule, basically, all the way to the rise of these massive stratified empires.
Wow.
And to understand that transition, we really have to start at the absolute ground floor. Which brings us to Section 1, the foundations of purpose biological drive versus collective existence.
All right. So if we strip back all the layers of meaning, all the stories we tell ourselves, what's our purpose from a purely biological default position?
Well, from that strict evolutionary perspective, purpose isn't really a conscious goal at all. It's simpler.
Simpler how?
It's defined simply as the inescapable drive to reproduce and survive. Dalton's work really emphasizes this mechanist view.
Mechanist? Like machines?
In a way, yes. Organisms are seen as essentially sophisticated vehicles, vehicles designed purely for the propagation of their genes.
Okay.
So a gene's purpose, if you can call it that, is simply to ensure it makes more copies of itself, to survive that next generational bottleneck. That's it.
That is a very cold, very hard definition, but foundational, I suppose.
It is.
We often forget that despite all our consciousness and complexity, we are still bound by those basic genetic imperatives. We're just highly complex survival mechanisms. Fundamentally.
Precisely. And if you look at human success, our dominance across the globe, it's not because we're the strongest animals or the fastest.
Right.
It's almost entirely down to mechanical survival advantages. We succeeded because of traits like our large brains,
Crucial.
which allowed for complex problem-solving, planning, and things like bipedal locomotion. Walking upright freed our hands for tool use, for carrying resources.
Simple mechanics, huge impact.
Exactly. These are the evolutionary mechanics that allowed our species to thrive, to outcompete others, but they don't carry any inherent philosophical weight or meaning. They just worked.
But here's the paradox, isn't it? The human story is defined by this twist. To successfully propagate those individual genes, we had to stop acting purely as individuals.
That's the pivot.
We quickly run into the social perspective, this rise of we, which seems to fundamentally change the definition of individual purpose.
The shift is absolutely profound. When you contrast that individual gene drive with the collective existence of humanity, well, the individual's ultimate fate becomes inextricably linked to the group's fate.
So my success depends on the group's success.
Increasingly, yes. The social definition suggests that the purpose of an individual becomes contributing to the well-being of the group, or passing on critical knowledge, traditions, skills to the next generation.
Ah, so the information transfer.
Right. It shifts the vector of replication, you could say, from purely internal genetic code to an external shared cultural code.
And this is where studying human ethology becomes so important, right? Looking at our behavior from that evolutionary perspective.
Yes, exactly.
Things like altruism, for instance. On the surface, that seems to defy the self-interest of the gene. Why would you risk your own life or resources for the group?
Because ultimately the risk is calculated, evolutionarily speaking, for collective survival. The source material highlights several critical behaviors that support group longevity, sometimes even at the cost of the individual.
Like what?
Well, successful mating strategies, obviously, but also establishing social hierarchies.
Hierarchies. How do they help?
They minimize internal conflict, they allocate roles and duties efficiently. Then there's altruism, as you mentioned, and perhaps the most crucial differentiator for our species: intensive cooperation.
Cooperation on a massive scale.
Unprecedented scale. These behaviors aren't arbitrary, they are evolutionary strategies. Historically, they offered a collective survival advantage that far outweighed strict short-term self-interest.
So a cooperative group is just better at surviving.
Much better. A cooperative secure group is far more likely to ensure the propagation of the collective gene pool, the group's genes, than a loose collection of purely self-serving individuals would be.
And this intense need for cooperation, for working together, brings us directly to the bedrock of any organized society, the social contract. This feels like the moment where individual purpose really gets subsumed, or at least heavily shaped, by the requirements of the collective.
The social contract. Yeah, at its heart, it's really the implicit agreement among members of a society. An agreement to cooperate for mutual benefits, security, progress, stability, things like that.
It's less a philosophical declaration, maybe, and more like a binding operational manual for the group.
That's a good way to put it. It's functional.
So the key takeaway here for you, the listener, is that participation in this contract, following the rules, contributing fundamentally, becomes a key purpose of human existence within that group.
Absolutely.
You're no longer just responsible for, say, finding the next meal for yourself and your immediate kin. You're also responsible for maintaining the agreement, the system, that allows your entire community to survive and thrive.
And ultimately to ensure that your descendants have a safer, more predictable future.
Which requires cooperation.
And this is that critical transition point we mentioned. The group's need for coordinated long-term behavior starts to demand a different kind of purpose than simple biological instinct dictates.
It needs planning, rules.
Exactly. That implicit agreement is what lays the groundwork for cultural transmission and legacy, because once you agree to cooperate, you have to agree on how to cooperate, which requires shared rules, shared technology, shared goals, shared stories even.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting then. When that collective cultural purpose starts to dramatically overpower the purely genetic one. Let's move into section 2, where we analyze this shift in influence culture takes the wheel.
Right. And the central argument here from Dalton and related thinking is that the influence of cultural transmission, passing knowledge down through learning, and this idea of legacy.
Building something beyond yourself.
Exactly. That influence on the concept of human purpose began to dramatically outweigh other biosocial perspectives, particularly during the later stages of human evolution and the rise of civilization.
So the ability to store knowledge externally in the group became more valuable for survival and success than just having the best set of individual genes.
In many contexts, yes. The historical and social dimensions of purpose, what society demands of you, the skills you need to fit in, became far more important for success and survival than just the traits we simply inherited genetically.
So it wasn't enough just to be born strong or fast anymore.
Not entirely. You increasingly had to be born into a system, understand its rules, learn its technologies.
And this shift didn't happen overnight, presumably.
No, definitely not. It happened in incremental stages. The earliest stage is what anthropologists call cumulative cultural evolution, or CCE.
CCE. Okay.
This developed gradually over the last million years or so. It's basically our ability to learn from each other and, crucially, to build upon previously acquired knowledge.
Like a ratchet.
Exactly. It's often called the ratchet effect. We pass on knowledge, and the next generation adds a small refinement or combines ideas, ensuring cultural complexity generally only moves forward, or at least doesn't slip back too easily.
So this is the starting point for moving beyond pure instinct.
Right. We started storing vital information outside of our DNA and our practices and our tools, and eventually in our minds and language.
But then we hit what the sources call the crucial tipping point, this era of behavioral modernity. That sounds like when the cultural engine really shifted into overdrive.
That's a good analogy. That tipping point, associated with the emergence of modern language, complex abstract thought, and, by extension, much more sophisticated cultural transmission, it seems to have occurred roughly between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago.
And language is the key.
Language seems to be the ultimate tool for cultural transmission. because it allows for something truly radical, abstract rules and concepts.
Okay, explain that cognitive leap for us. What can complex language do that simple communication like alarm calls couldn't?
While simple communication might warn you of an immediate threat lion, complex language allows for much more. It allows for theory of mind.
Understanding others' perspectives.
Right, the ability to understand that someone else holds a different set of beliefs or intentions than you do. Crucially, it allows for standardized instruction. You can teach someone precisely how to build a complex tool like a sophisticated trap or how to tailor clothing without them just imitating you beside a fire.
You can describe it, plan it.
Precisely. And critically, it allows for long-term planning, for defining complex non-physical entities, things like gods, laws, kinship rules, future generations. This is where shared manufactured purpose really begins to take shape.
And the sources use specific technological examples, right, to show this cognitive shift actually happened. These aren't just basic survival tools. They represent sophisticated, socially transmitted knowledge.
Exactly. Things like tailored clothing and eyed needles. We have evidence for those going back at least 30,000 years, maybe more.
Needles of eyes. Okay, why is that significant?
Because making form-fitting clothing, especially in cold climates, isn't instinctive. It requires sophisticated knowledge of materials which hides work best, how to prepare them. It requires knowledge of cutting patterns and the technique of stitching pieces together securely using thread passed through an eye.
So the whole process.
A complex, multi-step process that has to be taught and learned. It represents a formalized, non-genetic purpose, the purpose of staying warm not just through biological adaptation, but through culturally transmitted technology. It demonstrates a massive cultural investment in survival that must be taught, remembered, and probably improved upon across generations.
That slow, cumulative buildup over hundreds of thousands of years is just massive. But the real game changer of the moment, culture didn't just, steer the car, but basically built the entire freeway system for humanity that was the Neolithic Revolution.
Ah, yes, the Great Transition. Starting around, 12,000 years ago? This is where the old biological constraints are almost completely rewritten by a cultural innovation.
How so?
Well, before this, human purpose day-to-day was largely defined by the relentless scarcity and mobility of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Find food today, move tomorrow.
Right. So let's get into the mechanics here, because this feels like where the deep dive really matters. How did agriculture actually guarantee a surplus? And what did that guarantee require from people?
The transition to agriculture wasn't just about scattering some seeds. It was about intensive, culturally transmitted knowledge. Knowledge about selective breeding, choosing the best plants. Knowledge about seasonal cycles, planting times, harvesting times. And critically, knowledge about long-term storage.
Keeping the food safe.
Yes, by domesticating key crops like wheat, barley, rice, maize, humans essentially entered into a kind of Faustian bargain. They traded dietary diversity and mobility for predictability and sheer volume of calories.
More food, but maybe less varied food.
Generally, yes. And techniques like early forms of irrigation, developing better tools like plows, and consistent seed selection, consciously choosing the plumpest seeds from the most successful plants year after year, all this created a reliable, often guaranteed, food surplus far beyond what the immediate environment alone could provide seasonally.
And that surplus, that's the hinge upon which all of civilization seems to swing.
Absolutely. The presence of a guaranteed, storable surplus did several key things. First, it allowed for denser populations because you no longer had to constantly chase your food across a large territory. People could settle down.
Stay in one place.
Which led directly to the establishment of the first permanent settlements, then larger villages, and eventually the first cities and states. This massive demographic and economic shift paved the way for much more complex social contracts, highly formalized cooperation,
rules, laws,
and, crucially for our discussion, the institutionalization of passing on knowledge and traditions. Purpose becomes tied to maintaining this new, settled way of life.
So what's insight here is critical for the listener. Purpose was no longer just about finding food for yourself today. It became about protecting the farm, maintaining the village's irrigation system, obeying the rules of the town or city, contributing labor towards a collective infrastructure. Walls, granaries, temples that ensured the surplus continued year after year.
Yes. The structure of the collective, the system itself, became the definitive purpose of the individual living within it.
And that structure demanded a massive increase in complexity, didn't it? Which I guess brings us smoothly into Section 3. Civilization cements legacy and collective purpose.
Exactly. If the Neolithic Revolution built the road, you could say the rise of the first true civilizations starting around 3500 BCE in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus Valley, they cemented the pavement and installed all the traffic lights and complex interchanges.
Okay.
The development of these early civilizations was entirely predicated on the successful management of that agricultural surplus we just discussed. And think about the critical inventions that defined this new, culturally transmitted sense of collective purpose.
What kind of inventions are we talking about?
We're talking about things like writing, the wheel, used for pottery first, then transport, mathematics for counting and building, and perhaps most powerfully in shaping purpose, complex, organized religions.
That list itself is a perfect illustration of collective effort and collective necessity, isn't it? None of those things, writing, math, large-scale religion, can be invented or maintained by a single person in isolation. Nor can their benefits be retained by a single generation without some kind of formal, organized system for cultural transmission.
Take writing, for example. It's so much more than just a mechanism for telling stories or recording myths, though it did that too. Fundamentally, it's an externalized memory system, an unchangeable ledger, almost.
A way to make agreements permanent.
Exactly. It allowed for detailed laws that apply to everyone. It allowed for recording histories, which builds collective identity. And critically, for managing the surplus, it allowed for detailed accounting, tracking resource collection, storage, distribution, and, very importantly, taxation.
And mathematics.
Math was essential for complex engineering and architectural projects. Think about building monumental structures like pyramids or ziggurats, or designing and managing large-scale irrigation systems covering vast areas. You need geometry, arithmetic.
All requiring specialized knowledge.
Specialized knowledge that had to be developed, taught, and applied collectively. The individual's purpose, if they were involved in these things, was now to uphold the complex system that supported these collective institutions and projects.
And this explosion of complexity demands order, organization.
Mm.
But underlying all of this organizational complexity was that one simple requirement we keep coming back to from the Neolithic Revolution: agricultural surplus.
Mm-hmm.
That surplus was the necessary precondition, wasn't it, for specialization of labor?
Yes, this is really the economic foundation of the entire directional shift in human purpose we're tracing. Surplus basically solved, or at least significantly eased, the fundamental problem of daily survival for some members of the society.
Not everyone had to farm anymore.
Exactly. For the first time in human history, you could have large numbers of people specializing in roles other than direct food production. You could have full-time priests, scribes, soldiers, artisans, merchants, rulers, administrators, people who contributed value back to the system in different ways without physically working the land themselves.
And this economic shift led directly, and perhaps, as you said earlier, inevitably, to the accumulation of wealth and power at the top.
It certainly seems that way. You suddenly had a much clearer division emerge between those who controlled the resources, primarily the stored surplus grain, but also land, trade routes, information, and those who were still primarily responsible for producing those resources, mainly the farmers and laborers.
So the fundamental purpose of the farmer, in a way, remained feeding the community. But the fundamental purpose of this new elite class became managing, protecting, and directing the resource flow.
Precisely. And managing that flow meant creating rules, structures, ideologies, the complex, stratified hierarchy to ensure that the surplus benefited the system's architects and managers the most, while keeping the producers compliant.
So the collective purpose wasn't just emerging organically, it was being actively engineered, culturally engineered, by those who held the keys to cultural transmission and resource control.
That's a strong interpretation supported by the evidence, yes.
Okay, this makes the analysis in Section 4, who benefited? The architects of cultural purpose, absolutely crucial. We need to identify the major classes or groups who really solidified this new culturally directed purpose and gained the most from it.
Right. The sources outline what amounts to a new, much more complex and often unequal transactional social contract.
Transactional how?
Basically, the masses, the farmers, the laborers, provided the continuous food supply and the physical labor needed for large projects, and in exchange, they received, theoretically at least, stability, protection from internal chaos and external enemies, and crucially, a sense of shared purpose.
A reason for it all.
Yes, a sense of shared purpose that was largely created and maintained by the elite. This ideology was the mechanism for justifying the massive unequal labor requirements and the hierarchical structure itself.
And the key beneficiaries, the ones who gained the most in terms of status, wealth, and control over communal resources. The sources point to the highest levels of the new social hierarchy, right?
Primarily, yes. We're talking about the rulers, the priests, and the specialized administrators or scribes.
Okay, let's start with the most visible ones. The political and military rulers, the kings, the pharaohs, the early emperors, or warlords.
Their status and power placed them squarely at the apex of the social pyramid. Their legitimacy didn't just come from brute military might, although that was certainly part of it. It also came, importantly, from their organizational capacity.
The ability to manage things.
Yes. They were seen as the central authority that organized these large-scale, high-risk, high-reward projects that were vital for the continuation and expansion of the surplus. Things like coordinating massive irrigation networks, defending territorial boundaries through organized warfare, and directing monumental construction projects like temples or palaces.
So their role was functional, at least in theory. If the complex system failed, if the harvest failed due to bad management, or the city was overrun, the ruler was ultimately responsible.
Correct. And this functional necessity, real or perceived, was used to justify their immense resource control, which was often near absolute. They controlled the agricultural surplus, which was the foundational currency, the fuel of this new economy.
And that control gave them leverage.
Massive leverage. It allowed them to accumulate vast personal wealth, to support the entire non-food producing elite class around them, and to fund necessary military expansion to protect the state's resources and trade routes from external threats.
And they used this control strategically, didn't they? It wasn't just hoarding.
No, it was about maintaining power. They collected taxes or tribute, often in the form of grain. They controlled crucial trade routes. And critically, they distributed resources, land, food, luxury goods, titles to their loyal followers.
Rewarding loyalty.
Exactly. This distribution wasn't charity. It was a high-level strategic reinforcement of power. It ensured the loyalty of the key people who enforced the system on their behalf, the soldiers, the regional governors, the administrative class.
Okay. Next group. The priestly class. They often seemed to operate hand-in-hand with the rulers, didn't they? Creating the sort of spiritual or ideological architecture that made the whole system feel legitimate, even divinely ordained.
That's a very good way to put it. This is where the cultural transmission of purpose gets its deepest, most persuasive roots.
Their power seems less tangible, maybe, than a king's army, but perhaps infinitely more pervasive in daily life. How do they translate religious doctrine into actual social control?
Well, their status and power initially came from positioning themselves as the necessary intermediaries between the ordinary people and the powerful, often unpredictable gods that were believed to control nature and human destiny.
The gatekeepers to the divine.
Precisely. And they gained immense influence because they developed and controlled the religious doctrine, the rituals, the sacred texts, which they used to legitimize the power of the rulers and the existing rigid social hierarchy.
So they provided the justification.
Yes, this was the absolutely critical step in cultural transmission for social order, giving the entire system, including its inequalities, a divine purpose. By defining purpose as obedience to divine law or fulfilling one's cosmically mandated role, whether ruler or farmer, questioning the ruler or the hierarchy became tantamount to questioning the gods or the cosmos itself, a very powerful deterrent.
This provided that sort of non-auditable leisure for social legitimacy you mentioned earlier. If the king's power is divinely ordained by the priests, then the peasant's hard labor is also part of that same cosmic necessary order.
Exactly. And the priesthood didn't just deal in abstract faith, they dealt in hard assets. The economic role of temples in many early civilizations was profound.
How so? Weren't they just places of worship?
They were much more. Priests often controlled vast tracts of temple lands, farmed by laborers attached to the temple, and they received a significant portion of the agricultural surplus from the wider population through mandatory tithes and offerings.
So temples ended up functioning almost like massive redistribution centers and storage depots.
Precisely. Temples often became major economic centers in their own right. They were critical for storing and managing huge quantities of grain and other essential goods. This gave the priesthood enormous economic leverage.
They controlled the backup food supply.
Often, yes. They had the ability to distribute food to the lower classes, especially during times of famine or hardship, or perhaps seasonally, like providing seed grain after planting when personal reserves were low. This dual role, owning the spiritual narrative and controlling the emergency food reserves, cemented their power. It made them seem essential for both spiritual and physical survival.
So their defined purpose was maintaining the cosmic balance.
Which, conveniently, also meant maintaining the social status quo that benefited them and the rulers.
Okay. Finally, let's turn to the class that really represents the sheer administrative complexity created by this whole cultural shift, the scribes and administrators. Their purpose wasn't directly ruling or praying, but organizing the flow of information and resources that made the whole thing run.
Yes, their rise is fascinating because it's driven almost entirely by the cultural transmission of a very specific, difficult, and initially rare skill: literacy.
Reading and writing?
Exactly. With the rise of complex states, managing taxation for thousands of people, coordinating logistics for monumental construction projects, codifying and applying formal laws, there was an absolute explosion in the need for detailed, permanent record keeping.
So literacy became this specialized technology that made them indispensable.
Utterly indispensable to both the ruling class and the priestly class. Scribes were the ones who could translate the abstract demands and plans of the elite. We need this much grain, these are the laws, build this temple into concrete labor directives, tax requirements, inventory lists, legal judgments.
They were the interface, in a way.
A crucial interface.
Yeah.
And this skill, literacy, granted them immense status and respect in societies where most people were illiterate. Scribes were the gatekeepers of the formal cultural transmission system, the protectors and managers of the recorded knowledge that ran the entire state machine.
And their resource control. How did that work? They didn't own vast lands like rulers or temples, usually.
Their control derived directly from their function and skill. They managed the essential administrative functions for both the government and the temples, things like the collection and recording of taxes, tracking state resources and expenditures, administering written laws, managing personnel records for armies or large labor forces.
So while they didn't necessarily own the means of production, like land, or control the divine mandate,
Their skills granted them a comfortable living, often significant privileges, protection from manual labor, and, critically, a relatively high degree of potential social mobility compared to others.
right, that was a benefit absolutely unavailable to the vast majority of the farmers and laborers whose culturally engineered purpose remained pretty much fixed. Produce the food, build the stuff, and obey the rules set by others.
Yes. The entire civilization, therefore, was predicated on this intricate system of cultural transmission of rules, roles, justifications, and specialized knowledge. The surplus didn't just feed the people, it fed the complex institutions, the rulers, the priests, the administrators that created and maintained the hierarchy that directed human effort.
So our directional purpose, in effect, became whatever the controllers of the system defined it as, through their mastery of cultural transmission and resource allocation.
That seems to be the functional outcome, yeah.
Okay. So we've traced human purpose from that simple, almost mindless, non-conscious drive of a gene just trying to replicate, through the collective imperative of cooperation, which seems demanded by our specific evolutionary strategy,
Right
up to this highly engineered, culturally transmitted purpose of civilization, which appears largely defined by the necessity of first creating and then managing agricultural surpluses. Quite a trajectory.
It really is. And the journey, I think, shows that the knowledge that binds us today, the complex economic and structural systems we all operate within, are directly descended from that fundamental necessity of managing agricultural surplus millennia ago.
And the methods used to control it.
And, importantly, the highly effective mechanisms used by the emerging elites back then to control cultural transmission, the stories, the laws, the religious justifications.
Right.
The shift undeniably allowed humanity to organize itself on an unprecedented scale. It enabled technological and social feats that were absolutely unthinkable during the previous hundreds of thousands of years of hunter-gatherer existence.
Oh, and it's a big, but simultaneously, it fundamentally created these deep, enduring hierarchies, structures that defined exactly who benefited most from the resulting collective cultural legacy, and who was primarily there to support that structure through their labor.
Yes. The transition from an primarily individual biological purpose to a collective culturally defined purpose was, you could argue, existentially successful for the species as a whole. We thrived population-wise, but it also seems to have almost guaranteed massive systemic social stratification from the very beginning of civilization.
So what does this all mean for us now?
Well, this raises a really important question, I think, that builds directly on the source material's focus on cultural control and belief systems.
Okay.
We established that the invention of complex religions and the priestly class that managed them was absolutely critical in providing that shared, collective, culturally transmitted sense of purpose, the divine mandate to obey, the justification for the hierarchy in those crucial early civilizations.
Right, the ideological glue.
Exactly. So, given the historical effectiveness of those kinds of systems in manufacturing social compliance and defining human direction for millennia, what are the fundamental implications for our current collective human purpose when those traditional systems of cultural transmission, particularly those powerful religious belief systems, decline or radically change, as they have been doing in the modern, globalized, more secularized era?
Hmm. If the original glue that held the purpose of civilization together for thousands of years is dissolving or weakening, what mechanisms, what narratives, what controllers are rising today to replace it and define our collective purpose now?
That's the question. That is the structural legacy we all inherit and are living through right now.